She stood on the splintered planks of the auction block, a thing for sale. The sun was a hammer beating down on the dusty square, bleaching the color from the clapboard buildings until they looked like old bones. Her feet were bare, the skin cracked and stained with the memory of 100 miles of uncaring ground. Her dress, a sack of gray homespun, hung on a frame that was thin as a fence rail, clinging to her like wet paper. She did not look at the faces in the crowd, the ring of hard men and whispering women. Instead, she fixed her gaze on a loose thread at her cuff, a single fiber unspooling from the rest, and made it her whole world. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Voices swirled around her, sharp and prodding. A man named Brand, with a florid face and a vest stretched tight over a prosperous belly, paced before her. He owned the debt. He owned her. He extolled her virtues with the same tone he might use for a mare, noting her teeth and her presumed strength for work, ignoring the hollowness in her eyes. The crowd murmured, a low, guttural sound. Some laughed. A woman in a severe bonnet spat a stream of tobacco juice near the block, a punctuation mark of disgust. She felt their eyes on her like stones, heavy and bruising. She learned long ago to build a wall inside herself, a place of deep, quiet cold where the noise could not reach. She was a vessel empty and waiting for the next hand, the next voice, the next locked door. It was all the same wind, just blowing from a different direction. From the edge of the sparse crowd, leaning against the warm wall of the general store, a man watched. His name was Elias, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. He had not come for the auction. He had come for flour and salt, a journey he made only when the cupboards were bare. He was a man rooted in silence, his farm a lonely island in a sea of whispering prairie grass. His hands, calloused and mapped with scars from a life of work, were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn duster. He saw the woman on the block, and something inside him, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, stirred. It was not pity, not precisely. It was recognition. He saw the same stark emptiness in her that he saw in the mirror each morning. He saw the way she held herself perfectly still, a creature pretending to be invisible, hoping the predator would pass it by. He knew that stillness. He had lived in it since he buried his Sarah on the hill behind his house. Brand was working himself into a lather, his voice booming. $5. Do I hear 5? A strong back for $5. Can cook, can clean, guaranteed quiet. The last bit was a cruel joke, and a few men chuckled. Elias pushed himself off the wall. He did not know why. The impulse was a spark on dry tinder, catching before he had time to stomp it out. He moved through the handful of onlookers, his steps slow and deliberate, kicking up little ghosts of dust. The crowd parted for him. They knew him or of him. The quiet man from the drylands, the one who lost his wife to the fever and had not been the same since. He stopped before the block. He did not look at Brand. His gaze went to the woman. He saw the thread she was watching. He saw the tremble in her fingers she was trying so hard to hide. I'll take her, he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the heat and the noise like a cold knife. It was a voice that sounded like it came from under floorboards, rough and unused. Brand stopped mid-spiel. He blinked, his piggy eyes focusing on Elias. What was that, Thorn? I said I'll take her, Elias repeated, his tone flat. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his duster, loosened the drawstring, and tipped $5 silver onto the head of a nearby rain barrel. The clink of the coins was sharp, final. The price you asked? A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the expected outcome. Brand looked from the coins to Elias's hard, unreadable face. He had hoped for more, for a bidding war among the ranchers looking for cheap labor. But something in Elias's stance, a granite stillness, told him this was not a negotiation. It was a statement. He grumbled but scooped the coins into his fat palm. The deal was done. Elias stepped up to the block. The woman flinched as he approached, her eyes finally darting up to meet his. He saw a flicker of raw terror in them, the look of a rabbit cornered. He stopped a few feet away, holding up a hand, palm open, showing it was empty. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his coat. The blade clicked open. She shrank back, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. He did not move closer to her. Instead, he reached out and sawed through the coarse rope that bound her wrists to the post behind her. The fibers parted with a dry sigh. The rope fell away. He folded the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He did not offer a hand to help her down. He simply stood back, giving her space. The debt is paid, he said, his voice low and meant only for her. You are not owned. She stared at him, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She did not understand. Kindness was a foreign language, and she had forgotten all the words. Slowly, cautiously, she slid off the edge of the block, her bare feet landing silently in the thick dust. She stood before him, head bowed, waiting for the next command. Elias turned without another word and walked toward his wagon, which was hitched outside the store. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. For a creature who had only ever known a leash, the habit of following was stronger than the promise of freedom. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts, and the sounds of the town faded into the vast, waiting silence of the plains. The journey was a long, unspooling thread of silence. The wagon wheels groaned a constant, weary complaint against the baked earth. The sun beat down, relentless. Elias sat on the driver's bench, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon where the pale sky met the brown land. She sat in the back, among the sacks of flour and salt, huddled against the sideboards as if to make herself smaller. Hours passed. The landscape did not change, only shifted in texture. Rocky outcrops gave way to seas of dry grass that hissed in the hot wind. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the things they did not say, the questions he did not ask, and the history she would not tell. Once, around midday, he stopped the horse. Without a word, he reached back and handed her his canteen. She stared at it for a long moment before her cracked fingers reached out to take it. The metal was warm from the sun. She drank sparingly, the water tasting of tin and grace, and handed it back. Her hand brushed his for a fraction of a second. It was the first time they had touched. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He seemed not to notice, his expression unchanged as he took a swallow himself and clicked the horse back into motion. Dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange when they finally arrived. The farm was more a scar on the land than a home. A small, sturdy house of weathered gray wood, a barn whose roof sagged in the middle like a tired old man, and a web of fences struggling to keep the wild land at bay. Everything looked thirsty. Everything looked tired. The place was a mirror of its owner. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the barn. "We're here," he said, the words sounding loud in the quiet air. He unhitched the horse, his movements economical and practiced. She slid from the back of the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the cool, dusty earth of the yard. She stood there, a ghost in the twilight, her arms wrapped around herself, waiting. The wind turned mean, plucking at her thin dress. Elias led the horse into the barn, and she heard the sounds of him working, the clink of buckles, the soft thud of a feed bag. He emerged a few minutes later, wiping his hands on his trousers. He gestured toward the house with his chin. The inside was dark and smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something else. Absence. A deep, settled loneliness. He lit a single kerosene lamp on the main room table, and the light threw long, dancing shadows that clung to the corners. The room was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a cold stone hearth, shelves holding a few plates and tins. It was clean but unadorned, a place for surviving, not living. "You can sleep in there," he said, nodding toward a closed door. "The bed is made." She looked at the door, her expression tight with a familiar fear. Her life had been a series of closed doors. He seemed to understand. He walked over and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, containing a simple bed with a quilt, a washstand, and a small window that looked out onto the darkening plains. It was as spare as the rest of the house. He turned back to her, his face half hidden in shadow. "I don't lock doors," he said quietly. "Not in my house." He left her standing there and moved to the hearth, where he began methodically laying wood for a fire. This was the unspoken contract. "Here is food. Here is a place to sleep. Here is safety." He asked for nothing in return. She stood in the doorway of the small room, her new room, and watched the first flames lick at the dry wood. For the first time in a very long time, the walls around her did not feel like a cage. They felt like a promise. The days settled into a rhythm marked not by a clock but by the sun and the needs of the land. They moved around each other in a careful, silent ballet. He rose before dawn, his work taking him out to the fences and the fields. She woke to the sound of his departure, the soft creak of the floorboards, the click of the front door. In the quiet of the empty house, she began to work. She did not need to be asked. She swept the floors, the bristles of the broom whispering against the wood. She scrubbed the soot from the hearth until the stone was pale again. She found a stash of mending in a basket. His shirts, worn thin at the elbows, his socks, riddled with holes. With a needle and thread she discovered in a tin. She stitched them, her stitches small and neat, closing the wounds in the fabric. He would return at midday, sun-beaten and weary, to find a plate of bread and cheese on the table. He never commented on the tidiness of the house or the repairs to his clothes. He would simply eat, his eyes on his plate, and then rise and go back to his work. But she noticed that he left a bucket of fresh water for her by the door each morning, and that a small pile of firewood always appeared on the porch before dusk. They were building a language without words, a vocabulary of gestures. One afternoon, she wandered out past the barn. On a low rise overlooking the vast, empty sweep of the prairie, there was a single grave. A simple wooden cross, weathered to silver, stood sentinel over a mound of earth. The name carved into the wood was faint, almost erased by wind and rain. Sarah. She stood before it for a long time. There were no flowers, only a few stubborn weeds clinging to the soil. She knelt and, with her bare hands, began to pull them, one by one. She cleared the space around the grave until it was neat and tidy. She had no flower to place upon it, so she simply smoothed the earth with her palm. From the far end of the property, mending a section of fence, Elias saw her. He stopped his work, the hammer hanging forgotten in his hand. He watched her small, gray figure kneeling at his wife's grave. He felt a pressure in his chest, a strange and unfamiliar warmth spreading through the cold stone of his grief. She was tending to a sorrow that was not hers. When she finally rose and walked back to the house, he did not look away until she was gone from sight. That evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned the color of a bruise and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes. Rain came in hard, slanted sheets, drumming on the roof. They ate their supper of stew in silence, the only sounds the clink of their spoons and the rage of the storm outside. Later, as he sat by the fire, oiling a piece of leather harness, a crash of thunder shook the house to its foundations. It was followed by a small, sharp cry from her room. He froze, listening. Silence. He told himself it was nothing. The storm was loud enough to frighten anyone. But then he heard it again, a muffled sob. He put down the harness and went to her door, which stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open a little more. She was not in the bed. She was curled in the far corner of the room, on the floor, her arms wrapped around her head. She was trembling violently, her thin shoulders shaking with each peal of thunder. She was not afraid of the storm. She was afraid of the noise, the sudden violence that reminded her of other things, of fists and slamming doors. He did not go to her. He did not touch her. He knew a hand on her shoulder, even a gentle one, would feel like a cage descending. He simply stood in the doorway, a solid, unmoving shape against the flickering light from the main room. His presence was a silent promise, you are not alone in this. He stood there for a long time until the worst of the storm had passed and the thunder had grumbled its way east. Her trembling slowly subsided. She did not uncurl from her tight ball, but the shaking stopped. The house is quiet, he said, his voice low and rough. After my Sarah passed. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Sometimes a storm is better. He did not know why he said it. He had not spoken his wife's name to another soul in 2 years. He was sharing a piece of his own brokenness, offering it to her like a piece of bread. She did not respond. But in the deep quiet that followed his words, she slowly, carefully uncurled. She sat up, leaning her back against the wall, and drew her knees to her chest. She was still in the corner, but she was no longer hiding. He stood in the doorway for another minute, then turned and went back to his fire, leaving her door open to the warm, steady light. Something had shifted between them. They had shared a fear and a sorrow, and in doing so, had laid the first stone of a fragile bridge across the silent chasm that separated them. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. The raw heat of summer softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. A routine, comfortable as a worn quilt, settled over the small farm. She began to hum as she worked, quiet, fractured melodies that threaded through the silence of the house. He found he listened for them. He fixed the handle on the well pump that had always been stiff, making it easier for her to draw water. She took to baking bread. The first loaf was a disaster, dense and hard as a river stone. He sat at the table that night, sawing a piece off with his knife. He chewed it thoughtfully for a long moment, his jaw working. A little dry, he said, his face impassive. Her head snapped up, and for the first time he saw a spark of fire in her eyes, a flash of something other than fear or sorrow. A glare. It was magnificent. You didn't complain about mine, he added, gesturing with his knife toward the hardtack he usually ate. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing. She said nothing, but the glare softened into something else, something uncertain. A flicker of humor, perhaps? A truce. That loaf had died in vain, but it had accomplished something important. The quiet peace they had woven together with threads of routine and unspoken kindness was fragile, a spider's web in the morning dew. They both knew it. The world was a bigger place than their small, isolated patch of land. And the world had a long, cruel memory. The harbinger came on a crisp autumn morning. It was not a letter, not a plume of smoke. It was a shape on the horizon. Elias saw it first. He was on the roof of the barn, replacing a rotten shingle when his eyes caught the movement far to the east. A rider. Then another. 3 of them moving at a steady, purposeful pace, heading directly for his farm. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Riders did not come this way. There was nothing out here but him. He stopped his work, his hammer resting on the sun-warmed shingles. He watched them grow from tiny specks into the clear shapes of men on horseback. He knew with a certainty that was cold and absolute who they were and why they were coming. He climbed down the ladder, his movements stiff. She was in the small garden patch she had cultivated near the house, gathering the last of the tough-skinned squash. She looked up as he approached, her hands full of soil. She saw his face, and the quiet tune she had been humming died on her lips. She followed his gaze to the approaching riders, and all the color drained from her face. The wall of ice he had seen in her on the auction block slammed back into place. She became perfectly still. "Go inside," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but it carried an undeniable command. "Stay there." She did not hesitate. She dropped the squash and fled into the house, the door closing softly behind her. Elias walked to the center of the yard and waited. He did not go for his rifle, which leaned by the front door. He stood with his hands empty at his sides, a solitary, unmovable figure planted in the dust of his own land. He watched them come, the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves growing louder, eating up the distance, devouring the peace. The lead rider was Brand. His face was redder than Elias remembered, his fancy vest looking out of place against the harsh landscape. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces hard and indifferent. They reined in their horses a dozen feet from Elias, kicking up a cloud of dust that swirled around his boots. "Thorn," Brand said, his voice using a false heartiness that did not reach his eyes. "Quite the spread you got out here. A man could get lost." "Some men want to be," Elias replied, his voice level. "What do you want, Brand?" Brand's smile tightened. "Straight to business." "I like that. I've come for my property. The girl. My associates and I were passing through and I decided it was time to collect her." He made it sound like a casual afterthought, a debt being called in. "She is not property," Elias said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the air with the weight of stones. "And she is not yours." Brand laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I have a bill of sale says otherwise. I bought her fair and square when her last owner defaulted on a loan. You paid me $5 for her lease, Thorn, not her title. A temporary arrangement. I was feeling generous that day. Now my generosity has run out. I have a buyer for her up in the mining camps. Good price," he patted his saddlebag. "I'll even give you your $5 back. Call it a rental fee." The debt was paid, Elias repeated, his gaze unwavering. "She is free." "Free?" Brand scoffed, looking at his companions for support. "Things like her ain't free. They belong to someone. Now, are you going to step aside, or are we going to have to get unpleasant?" One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting casually toward the pistol on his hip. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The wind died down. The only sound was the jingle of a harness and the heavy breathing of the horses. Elias did not move. He was a root sunk deep into the earth. To move him, they would have to tear the whole world apart. "You are not welcome on my land," Elias said. "And you will not set foot in my house." Brand's face purpled with rage. He was not used to being defied, especially by a dirt-poor homesteader who smelled of grief and solitude. "You old fool. She's just a stray you picked up. She ain't worth dying for." He swung down from his horse, his boots thudding on the hard ground. "I'm taking what's mine." He took a step toward the house. Elias moved to block him, a simple, fluid motion that placed his body squarely between Brand and the front door. They stood inches apart, a confrontation of 2 opposing worlds. One of loud, greedy taking, and one of quiet, stubborn holding. The front door creaked open. Both men turned. She stood in the doorway, a shadow against the dim interior of the house. She was no longer the cowering creature from the garden. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire Elias had only glimpsed before. In her hands, she held the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She held it not like a tool, but like a weapon, its weight resting solidly in her grip. Bran stared at her, his mouth falling slightly open. This was not the broken, silent thing he remembered. This woman looked back at him, her gaze direct and unafraid. "She is not property," Elias said again, his voice softer now, but with an edge of iron that had not been there before. He was no longer just standing his ground. He was defending his home. Bran seemed to recover himself, a sneer twisting his lips. "Look at that." The little mouse found a stick. "What are you going to do with that, girl?" "Stir my coffee." He reached out a hand to shove Elias aside. And then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was cracked and rough from months of disuse, like a rusty hinge. But it was clear. "No," she said. The word hung in the air, small but immense. It was a refusal. It was a declaration. It was the sound of a wall inside her finally coming down. Not to let the world in, but to let herself out. Bran froze, his hands still in the air. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not an object to be bought and sold, but a person staring back at him with defiance in her eyes. The equation had changed. It was no longer 3 armed men against 1 grieving fool. It was 3 men against 2 people defending their world. She took a step forward out of the doorway and into the sunlight, the poker held steady. She did not raise it to strike, but the threat was there, quiet and absolute. She was not a cornered animal fighting out of fear. She was a woman standing on her own ground, protecting it. The 2 hired men exchanged a nervous glance. This was not what they had signed up for. They were bullies paid to intimidate the weak, not to get into a bloody fight with a crazy homesteader and a wild-eyed woman over a deal that was starting to feel sour. Their resolve wavered. Bran saw it. He looked from her unyielding face to Elias's granite-like calm. He saw the poker in her hands. He saw the rifle leaning just inside the door. He saw the cold, hard fact that this would not be easy. It would be messy. It might be deadly. And for what? For a creature he had dismissed as worthless. His greed warred with his cowardice, and cowardice won. With a curse, he spat on the ground. "Keep her," then he snarled, his bravado crumbling into spite. "She's probably broken anyway. You 2 deserve each other." He turned, heaved himself back onto his horse, and without another look wrenched the reins and galloped away. His 2 men, visibly relieved, wheeled their own mounts and followed their departure a cloud of frantic dust and fading hoofbeats. They stood in the yard, Elias and the woman, and watched them go until they were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The profound silence of the prairie rushed back in to fill the space they had left. The wind picked up again, whispering through the dry grass, and the world was theirs once more. The poker in her hands suddenly seemed very heavy. Her arm trembled, and she let it fall. It landed in the dust with a soft thud. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide, the fire in them banked now, leaving behind a vulnerable, human glow. He looked back at her, and in his gaze was a universe of respect, of awe. "You didn't run," he said, his voice quiet. "Neither did you," she whispered back. A new silence settled between them, but this one was different from all the others. It was not a silence of caution or emptiness. It was a silence of shared victory, of a bond forged in defiance. It was the silence of home. That night, the house felt different. It breathed. The emptiness in the corners had been pushed out by the warmth of the fire and the quiet hum of their shared presence. After their meal, Elias did not retreat into his shell of chores. He sat at the table, watching her as she cleared the plates. "I never asked your name," he said. The question was a landmark, a signpost in a land they had navigated without maps. She stopped, a plate held in her hands. She looked away from him, her gaze drifting toward the window that faced the hill, toward the small, lonely cross that marked Sarah's grave. "I didn't have one that mattered," she said softly. The names she had been called were Bran's, labels of ownership, not identity. They were part of the life she had left behind in the dust of Bran's departure. Elias was quiet for a long time, his expression thoughtful. He looked at her, at the strength he had seen in her that afternoon, the resilience that was like the tough prairie grass, bent by the wind but never broken. He saw the quiet kindness in her tending of his wife's grave, the spark of fire in her glare over the bad bread. He saw a person, whole and complete, who had been waiting for a name to match. "Lena," he said. The name was simple. It was soft. It held no history of pain. He said it as if he were placing a precious, fragile thing in her hands. She turned her head slowly to look at him. She tasted the name on her tongue without speaking it. Lena. It felt right. It felt like her own skin. It was a gift, the first one she had ever truly been given. She gave a single, slow nod. An acceptance. A beginning. A tear, the first she had shed in his presence, slid down her cheek, tracing a clean path through the dust of the day. She did not wipe it away. The next day, Elias took the charred iron poker she had held and, in the heat of his forge, hammered it not into a weapon but into a new hinge for the barn door, turning an instrument of defense into an act of building. It was a symbolic act, burning away the last of the old fear. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And in the weeks that followed, Lena began to stitch their lives together with raw thread. She hung a curtain made of a bleached flour sack over the small window in her room. She found a patch of stubborn wildflowers behind the barn and transplanted them to Sarah's grave, bringing a splash of defiant color to the lonely hill. The house began to feel less like a shelter and more like a sanctuary. One evening, as the autumn chill deepened and the sun set in a blaze of glory, they sat together on the porch steps. They did not speak. They watched the sky fade from orange to deep indigo, listening to the chirr of the crickets and the sigh of the wind. A comfortable silence had finally replaced the heavy one. He had offered her a blanket and she had taken it, wrapping it around her shoulders. Underneath it, their shoulders brushed, and this time neither of them pulled away. The lamp she had lit in the window cast a warm, steady glow behind them, a beacon in the vast, dark expanse of the prairie. The house, once a hollow monument to loss, was breathing again. It breathed with their quiet presence, with the promise of a shared future, with the simple, profound truth that two broken souls, in stitching each other back together, had accidentally created a family. The land was still harsh, the winters would still be long, but they would not face them alone. They had found their home in the space between two silences. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about recognition. It's about seeing the person buried inside the wreckage and having the courage to call them by a name they have not yet heard themselves. So many are discarded, left on the block of public opinion or private cruelty, their value dictated by others. We are told we are what we have lost or what has been taken from us. But what if our true value is in what we are willing to build in the silence after the noise has faded? What if kindness is not a grand gesture, but a series of small, unspoken acts, a shared meal, a mended shirt, a door left unlocked, a presence that stands guard against the thunder? Some people are just waiting, not to be saved, but to be seen. To be handed a name that feels like a key, one that unlocks a person they had forgotten they could be. So here is your naming. Your naming is not the label the world has given you. It is the quiet, steady action you take today to build a sanctuary for yourself and for the other lost souls you find along the way. It is in the choice to stand firm, to speak a simple no to the world's cruelties and a quiet yes to the fragile hope of a new beginning. And if you were brave enough to do that, you might just find that the home you were building for someone else was the one you were searching for all along.